Normally, when we do the top 5 worst games of the year, we usually start with games that are a bit disappointing. Not great, but maybe have some kind of merit, and then we work our way down to the really bad games. Not this time! We've got some real stinkers this year. Now, normally I avoid targeting smaller studios and indie games, but Jesus Christ, this year it's been fucking inexcusable. The entire goddamn list is filled with them. AAA was actually not very abhorrent this year, believe it or not. So, without further delay, let's get right to the list. Number 5, Aztec, Forgotten Gods. The least awful game on this list, but still pretty terrible. I hate trashing on games formed by brand new studios with some cool ideas, but not only is Aztec's gameplay a brainless button masher with the occasional QTE thrown in, but the game is extremely unpolished. There are all kinds of visual bugs and game glitches, but aside from the technical aspects, the game's presentation is really hideous.
Holy Jesus. What is that? What the fuck is that? What is it?
Despite the unique setting and concept art direction, the story is mind-numbingly dull. The game is front-loaded with so much dialogue, you'd think that the developers were trying to run out the 2-hour return window clock on Steam before players got to actually get to the gameplay, which again is extremely shallow at best. The developers would rather push the game on new platforms rather than fix its current problems, as there hasn't been one peep about a patch since launch. A waste of your $30, don't even bother. Camaramelia, Scarlet Symphony. Yes, Scarlet Symphony at number 4. It sucks. It's got frustrating flash game level difficulty, and it's $30 for 1 hour of content with no replayability. This is a re-release, and they didn't even bother making it any good. Fuck you. Number 3, Wing Breakers. The first game I've perhaps ever played that made me physically ill outside of VR. At least in VR, I wanted to keep playing and get used to it. I don't want to play any more of this title, and not just because it makes me ill. The planes control like you're in a bubble of jello. The tracks are as short as 1 minute, despite making you wait almost that long just to get into an offline game. Yes, you heard that right. You have to wait 40 seconds to queue up for a game that you're playing offline if you're doing split screen, because it uses the same menu system as the online mode. Like it's waiting for everyone to queue up and getting ready. This game has been in early access for almost an entire decade, yet it feels like an alpha still. The gameplay is so boring, so repetitive, so mindless, so thrown together. Easily number 3 on this list. Awful. Number 2, Witchcrafty. Easily the most frustrating game I've played this year. Yes, even worse than Scarlet Symphony. That game at least had functioning controls. It was hard, it had bad design, but at least the controls worked. Witchcrafty's controls are literally broken. The game eats inputs all the time, making it one of the most unresponsive released platforms I've ever played on Steam. Your player character simply won't jump or dodge when you tell them to at times. Otherwise, it's just mediocre at best. It's a game that is kinda hard to begin with, but due to its busted controls, it becomes one of the most frustrating games I've played this year, and an utter waste of time. Witchcrafty was originally one of the last games released on the PlayStation Vita, and that version of the game was also buggy and filled with problems. It comes out almost a year later on PC, and not one problem has been fixed. It's a total piece of shit, and the fact that it wasn't fixed on Vita, and still isn't fixed now, is absolutely fucking shameful. Shame on the developers for selling broken garbage knowingly. It gets number 2 on my list just for the sheer fucking gall. What the fuck? And finally, number 1. Oh boy. So, let's just get right into it. Super Meat Boy Forever. Perhaps a bit harsh. It's technically a functional product that plays a lot better than most games on this list. In fact, I'd say maybe all of them. But it is a perfect example of successful indie studios copying their AAA counterparts in their practices. You know, the self-immolating, unsustainable, slave-driving AAA companies that rely solely on branding to make money and not on good software that indie developers wanted to get away from in the first place. Super Meat Boy Forever was technically released in 2021 on the Epic Game Store as part of an exclusivity deal, but now it's available on Steam. Now, an exclusivity deal. This isn't some unknown studio that's making some crazy, risk-heavy passion project and needs a piece of Timmy 10 cents Fortnite cash. This is Team Meat, releasing a sequel to one of the most recognizable and best-selling indie games of its time, perhaps of all time. Of course, it will sell well. Unless this game is not what its title says it is. Unless it's not Super Meat Boy at all. And almost none of the original developers of Super Meat Boy worked on it. I mean, come on, it's not a completely different, dumbed-down game compared to the first, positioned as some kind of mindless cash grab. Oh, that's exactly what it is. Edmund McMillan, the game's original artist, is gone. Danny Baranowski, the original composer, is gone. That just leaves Tommy Raffines, the original programmer. So how'd the game turn out? Pretty bad as it happens. The game is an auto-runner. Yeah, like you'd play on a mobile device. Super Meat Boy Forever, a sequel to a game based on Twitch-based platforming reaction and a really interesting, surreal, darker art style using an interesting mix of hand-drawn and pixel art combined with an incredible soundtrack, is now an auto-runner with a simplified, cartoonish art style and an unmemorable, generic soundtrack. None of the charm that made the original game is here. The game resembles something I'd play for a minute at a time on the toilet. Like an iPhone game. Wait a second. Tommy Raffines, didn't he shit on the Apple App Store for their curation of bad games? Games that in particular relied on branding rather than good gameplay? And didn't he release a bad Super Meat Boy game as a joke years ago to prove this point? Oh hey, there's actually a quote from a developer conference. Super Meat Boy Handheld, that's the game that he released as a joke, is all the branding of Super Meat Boy without the actual gameplay or art from Super Meat Boy. You make fun of the App Store for releasing cash grabs with bad gameplay because they're gonna sell based on the name, and then you just do that. Oh my god, I don't even need to say anything else. The list writes itself. It's honestly fitting that this game is number 1. You might find it unfair, but while technically a lot more playable and generally more polished than anything on this list, it's still a soulless cash-in. We finally lived to see the day when one of the original indie darlings, one of my favorite games of all time, the property for it gets dragged through the mud. Every other developer on this list at least might have been passionate about what they've made at some point. Maybe it was an unnecessary re-release like Scarlet, but at least that game has some substance to it. And maybe the developers were actually trying, but just unable to make something good, and we ended up with Wing Breakers. Aztec at least had some unique ideas and is somewhat ambitious, and Witchcrafty, while massively broken, at least has some nice visual design. There is nothing original or creative about Super Meat Boy Forever. There is nothing inspirational about it. It is worthless to the Super Meat Boy name. It is one of the most soulless games I've ever played. It would be almost possibly forgivable if the game was at least good, but it's not. It's just not very good. The platforming is dull, there's some annoying cheap deaths, the pacing is crappy, the level design is boring. This game throws so much bullshit at you, and the controls suck! And it feels like one of those early, terrible Flash games where you're dying constantly and I gotta readapt to some bullshit that's thrown at me every 3 seconds. The game's controls just suck. Having one button be your attack and jump is just fucking terrible. Especially for boss fights. I legit got so pissed, I had to stop playing during the first boss fight, and I refused to go any further. Having your attack button function unlike any other type of attack button where you have to time it very carefully before you touch something and you have to kind of do it in the air is so annoying. Oftentimes, I'm attacking something like, okay, time to dodge the boss attack, better jump away, and like, oh, it went into attack mode again. I have to delay my jumps now before I do it. I've seen some people, in order to get around this, they've had to bust out a keyboard and bust out the controller and tap the button that does jump only and then tap the other button that does jump and punch at the same time. So they're cycling between using a keyboard and a controller at the same time. That is so insane. And these are the people who actually beat the game, and they still come out and say, yeah, this game sucks. The only reason why I did it because I was a diehard fan, and even then it wasn't very good. So in an attempt to admittedly innovate, the developers here have made something very frustrating that just doesn't work at all. There is a reason why autorunners are generally pretty simple in their design. They are designed like rhythm games because there is a rhythm to the level. Sometimes gameplay is tied directly to the beat of a song in a level, and therefore there is a flow and momentum that works. It does not work in Super Meat Boy because there is no momentum in the levels. The levels are constantly hammering you with different bullshit every few seconds. I was wondering why the levels are so terrible, why they don't look very cohesive, and why they just have assets and shit everywhere, and I found out why. The levels are randomly generated. Why? The more I play it, the more I hated it. God! Some of us waited over a decade for this game, and I'd rather we got nothing. It is beyond disappointment. It deserves the worst game of the year on principle alone for being a soulless cash grab. But Jesus Christ, it's so poorly designed that I just refuse to play it any further to even get footage for it. And I'm done. Fuck this game. Good night. Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to check out some better games that I actually played more of, you can check out my top 5 best games of 2022. And I also have another video called the best early access games of 2022. You can check those two out for some more positivity. On a less positive note, though, I am pretty much done with YouTube. I will be making a follow-up video to this explaining why, but if you want to actually stay tuned for that video, I'll have that up hopefully soon after this one. So, yeah. Anyway, guys, thank you very much for watching, and thank you for supporting my channel. Have a good one.